Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Landy Lodge. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about Hyrule Warriors, Age of Calamity. But before we continue pressing on, we have a lot of people we need to thank. Those people being the sages of the lodge, those who donate monthly to keep the lodge moving. Just want to give a big shout out to Alex Pamal, David Fries, Shane Driscoll, Chris Perkowski, Corey Barchat, Scott Castellano, The Family, Andrew Parker, Nick Taborski, Charlotte Astry, Kevin McBride, Michael Fay, Richard Arnold, Daniel Muller, and one of the GOATs, Andrew Clay. Again, thank you all so very much. If you'd like to become a Sage of the Lodge, there's a link in the episode description, both on the audio platforms and YouTube. Just drop down below and you'll be able to find it. However, enough of that ear beating. Let's move on to Age of Calamity. Now, first things first, this is not your typical Zelda game. This is a very different Zelda game than what we're used to. It's based on the Dynasty Warriors series, and I was excited when the news was announced, but then there's that part of me, whenever a spin-off game for a series I love comes around, you have to wonder, is this just an empty cash grab? Luckily, we had a previous Hyrule Warriors that came out years ago that was nothing short of a good time, so I had some faith going into this that this particular version would pull through. Now, here we are. I'm recording this on December 8th, so it's been almost a month since the game has been out. It's been a couple weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And I figure we're going to go facet for facet through this game, and I'll give you my thoughts. Starting with the gameplay, first and foremost, as I always like to do. So I'll say this. I hope, in my heart of hearts, that Breath of the Wild 2 borrows something from the combat in this game. Because, I could talk all day about the combat when you're fighting hordes of enemies. Like when hundreds of enemies are in front of you, let's just be honest, part of the fun is you could press whatever button you want and those dudes are gonna go flying. And that's a good time, seriously. It's a lot of fun to just try pressing buttons in different orders and seeing what different combos come from it, picking your favorite combos between the different characters and kind of sticking to them. However, I think the gameplay really shines in the one-on-one battles, or when you're battling the bigger enemies who are surrounded by the little enemies. I like that the Flurry Rush window is a little bit bigger than Breath of the Wild. Sometimes I feel like the Flurry Rush window in Breath of the Wild is a little too small. I like that Hyrule Warriors expanded it even just a little bit. So actually, before I continue on, I do want to say that even though this was a Warriors game, it really felt like you were playing Breath of the Wild through a lot of it. Like the way the characters handled, things in the combat that were consistent, like the Flurry Rush, like using the different runes in the Sheikah Slate, it really did feel true to Breath of the Wild. But going back to the gameplay specifically, I felt like the combat with the one-on-one battles was really where the gameplay shined the most. Getting locked into battles with like the Stone Talus or the Big Lizalfos or even the Lynels. I do wish the Lynels were a little tougher. I will say I love fighting the Lynels in Breath of the Wild. They're a little bit higher in difficulty, whereas they're a little bit easier in Age of Calamity. So I wish they would have ramped that difficulty up a little bit. But, I think one of the things that makes this game so appealing is that in the mainline Zelda games, you're pretty much stuck playing as Link, which is great. Link's a great protagonist. He's a lot of fun. And in this game, ironically enough, he might be my favorite character to play as. But with that said, the big appeal with this game is that you can now play as whatever character you basically want. I mean, you don't get to play as Scotty and Pura. I mean, at least not in the campaign. Spoiler alert, by the way. I am going to be spoiling the plot later down in this episode. But sticking to the gameplay for now. I thought, at least in the campaign, you were going to get to play as Scotty and Pura. You're not. Maybe they can be unlocked later. I don't know. But getting to play as all the champions, and spoiler alert, by the way, big spoilers coming, and getting to play as the new champions, the likes of Yunobo, Riju, Teba, Sidon. I mean, you got to play as all of these guys. And again, being a fan of the Zelda series, you're kind of stuck playing as Link all these times. It is nice to be immersed within the Zelda universe and get to play as other characters, especially ones that you loved. Most importantly for me, I really got a kick out of playing as Zelda. Because I have to say, I love this incarnation of Zelda. I think arguably Breath of the Wild Zelda, as a character, we could talk about designs and other things, but as a character, I really think Breath of the Wild Zelda might be the strongest incarnation. She's an absolute blast to play as. I love that there's basically two different movesets for her, depending on the weapon. You could either play with the Sheikah Slate, or she gets her, like, light arrows later in the campaign. And playing as, like, light arrow Zelda is a whole other animal. And I absolutely loved it. And I don't know if you saw my podcast a few weeks ago about Age of Calamity. I was begging to play as Zelda versus Ganon at some point in the story. And we'll get more into it later, but I was very happy to see that you do get the opportunity to finally play as Zelda in a Zelda-Ganon showdown. It's always Link versus Ganon, and sometimes Zelda's with you, like in Twilight Princess, to fight alongside you. But it was nice for once to be given the option to fight the big bad as Zelda herself. But getting back to the gameplay. There were so many aspects of it I liked. Sticking to the combat, the flurry rush window being larger, being able to use the runes so fluently within combat, having to dismantle enemy shields. There's just so much that was brought into the combat that I want to see Breath of the Wild 2 use moving forward. On top of the gameplay, there wasn't much exploration, which I was a little bit let down by. I didn't expect there to be much exploration just because it's a Warriors game at the end of the day, but I was hoping that maybe there could be some sort of overworld exploration. There wasn't, so I was a little bit let down by that, but it was nothing I was expecting from the beginning. I will say, filling out the map, like for those of you who haven't played the game, basically you'll see the map of Hyrule, and there will be all these side missions marked in yellow, and then when you complete them, they get marked in blue. And there was something just crazy where I just got addicted to adding blue to that map. I got a strange satisfaction out of turning a yellow icon into a blue icon. And again, there were many things that got me addicted to this game. Seeing your progress in front of you constantly, like, for example, I've been 100%ing Persona 5 Royal the last few weeks. I've got a couple trophies left. But I have to constantly back out of the game and look through the trophy list to see where my progress is. What I love so much about this user interface within Age of Calamity is the whole thing is right in front of you. You don't need to back out. You don't need to look at a list online. The whole thing is pretty much right in front of you. And when that whole map is marked in blue, you'll know that you've done it. Let's talk about the weapon system. The weapon system, I thought, was really strong. Really, really strong. I mean, I know some people had a problem with the weapons breaking in Breath of the Wild. I personally didn't see an issue with it because there's an abundance of weapons everywhere. And it requires you to be resourceful, which is a big part of the game in Breath of the Wild. By the way, it's how resourceful can you be. But that's not a concern here in Hyrule Warriors. This is a hack and slash, baby. So I love that basically you can get all different weapons for these characters. And depending what weapon you use dictates the moveset. I got into it a little bit with Zelda having the light arrows and the Sheikah Slate. But the same thing goes for characters like Link, where you can use the Master Sword and run train. But if you wanted to, you could use a Lizalfos boomerang, you could use a Gerudo spear, you could use the Guardian axe, and all of these weapons come with their own unique movesets. And what I love so much about this, and this is something these Warriors games do very well, is whether it's differentiating movesets with different weapons or differentiating movesets with different characters, there's just so much you can do to keep the game feeling fresh. Like, for example, I mostly stayed glued to Link, Zelda, and Impa through this game. By the way, loved playing as Impa. I've always been a big fan of that character, and having her be playable and seeing her in a different sort of role. Like, she's still Princess Zelda's guardian, but in all the other games, she takes on this, like, authority type figure for Zelda. Whether she's like an old ancient in Skyward Sword, or whether she's like this older cousin aunt figure in Ocarina of Time. She always has sort of that role. Where here, in Age of Calamity, she's almost like a best friend to Zelda. Like, she's Zelda's best girl. Like, when Zelda gets married, that's her maid of honor. Like, that's who's got her back. Very cool to see that. A lot of fun playing as that character. But going back to the overall point here, one thing I think this game does really well is something as simple as changing the character you play as or changing the weapon you use suddenly makes the game feel fresh again. And that went a long way for me when it came to ripping this game. I want to 100% it. I think I've done 72% so far. It just stays fresh, and it has ways of staying fresh. And I think that's really cool, and I hope to see more of that. But let's talk about the music now. I think I've ratted on about the gameplay enough. I'll come back around when we get into the story. It'll certainly come up. But let me just finish off with the weapon system, actually. The weapon system I thought was great because you can level up your weapon just like you level up your character. It's a very RPG kind of feel. And where Breath of the Wild sort of dabbled in RPG elements, Hyrule Warriors is doubling down on RPG elements, and I hope that Breath of the Wild 2 incorporates some of them. But again, that's enough on the gameplay. Let's talk about the music. The music was fantastic. Usually, if a game is constantly repeating an overworld theme or a main menu theme at me, I get sick of it. But like that main overarching theme that plays, it's in my head in my day-to-day activities. It still slaps for me. I just think there aren't a lot of original songs in the game. Like, the game does use a lot of Zelda songs and incorporates them, especially from Breath of the Wild. Zelda's Lullaby is used a lot, which is good. I think Zelda's Lullaby should have a preference in as many Zelda games as we can. It didn't have as much of a presence in Breath of the Wild 1 as I would have liked, but from what we can see here in Age of Calamity, they seem to be implying that Zelda's Lullaby is going to be a big part moving forward. But music-wise, I thought it was fantastic. The battle music. So here's something my boy Big C talks about a lot. In the combat, what you're ideally trying to do is break your enemy's shield. Because until you break down their shield, every time you hit them, it doesn't do a lot of damage. But when you break their shield, the damage is for the taking. Every hit does exponential damage. One thing I love is when you break a character's shield, the music amplifies. And that just does so much to immerse you in the game and make you feel like you're really in battle and doing something right. So I just want to tip my cap to them. I want to see more games do this, and this was something that I felt Age of Calamity did exceptionally well. Because if we're being honest, music is part of what immerses us into these experiences. So having just small little notations like ramping up the music as the battle amplifies goes such a long way. So the music was fantastic. The gameplay was really very good. Really wish there was an exploration part to it, because that's at the core of every Zelda game, especially Breath of the Wild. But I'm not complaining. It's just something I would have liked. But now I see we're approaching 13, 14 minutes in here. I suppose we can start talking about the story. Now, I guess first let me talk about some characters and overall what I thought here. So I guess let me lead with what disappointed me, because I have a lot of good things to say, and I could go on and on about it, but I want to be honest, and I want to lead with what disappointed me a little bit here. So, I don't want to go out and tell you Nintendo lied, because I don't think it's that nefarious, but it seemed to me the implication here was this was a prequel to Breath of the Wild 1, and in some ways it still is, but what it seemed that we were getting, it seemed like what we were getting was this is exactly what happened the 100 years before Breath of the Wild. That we were going to see, shot for shot, one for one, what happened during this time that led us into Breath of the Wild, right? All the memes going around were saying, oh my god, we're going to have to play in that final mission when they all die. And maybe I'm a bit of a sicko, but I actually was kind of looking forward to that. I think that would have made for a really cool scene. Like if you think of, for all you Final Fantasy fans out there, the ending of Crisis Core, you know, where you're playing as Zack, but then you're in that final mission and you have to play as him, hopelessly fighting against the Shinra who are inevitably going to kill you. Like when the gameplay can get that intimate with the story, I think it makes the player feel the emotional impact all the more. So I was really looking forward to that. I thought we were going to have that Crisis Core prequel moment at the end here where we watch all the champions die, we take Link to the Shrine of Resurrection, and we watch Zelda seal us in Hyrule Castle, waiting for Link's return in Breath of the Wild. However, and again, I said this before, I just want to say it again, major spoilers coming. What we do learn is that Tarako, the little guardian egg, who has an affinity for Zelda, effectively came from the future to try and prevent the calamity, but what that did was create a timeline split. So when Tarako traveled back in time, instead of looping back on this same timeline, effectively it just created a whole new deviation. And essentially what we're doing in this deviation is trying to prevent the calamity. And what did Tarako do? He summoned the future champions back into our world. And I remember when I first saw it, like I think Sidon was the first one I saw appeared. I thought it was cool. I couldn't wait to play as Sidon, but I remember thinking, I do kind of wish this was just a true prequel to Breath of the Wild. However, even though that's a little bit of a disappointment for me, however, I do believe the story they told here was a good story. I really do believe that. I enjoyed the story they had to tell. I really enjoyed getting to play as more characters. Not just the Calamity Age characters, but present-day Breath of the Wild characters like Sidon, like Inobo, like Riju, like Teba. It was a blast playing as those characters. And seeing, and this is where the story got fun, right? Like, even though I wish they stuck to just being a flat prequel, this is where the story got fun. Seeing Yunobo interact with Daruk and the like, Riju with Urbosa and stuff, that is awesome. And here's the thing. They didn't really come from the future. They came from our Breath of the Wild timeline. So what I think is cool about this is where you have say a Riju or a Yunobo who didn't get to meet Daruk and Urbosa. Now they're going to travel back to Breath of the Wild 2, having had experiences with these champions. And I think that's cool. I think that creates a little bit of context that could be a lot of fun in the sequel. Because obviously, while the champions in Breath of the Wild are dead, their spirits inhabit the divine beasts. So it would be really cool to see if any of that chemistry that they developed with the champions carries us over into Breath of the Wild 2. But going back to the story, I think they told a really good story here. And I think it delivered a lot of fun moments because at the end of the day, with video games mostly, these stories are very character driven. The reason we love these stories, be it Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, whatever it is you love, Fire Emblem, the reason we fall in love with these universes is because of the characters. It's just the way video game storytelling mostly is that it has to be very character driven. And seeing Age of Calamity deliver on some character moments that you could have only prayed for when Breath of the Wild 1 came out was remarkable. Remarkable. Like, I'm more invested now in Revali and Link's relationship moving forward. Their friendship, I should say. I'm more invested now in these new champions. Like, I'm not gonna lie, Yunobo didn't quite stick with me. I think he's a cool character, but it's the whole scaredy cat trope that just seems too flat. But in Age of Calamity, without getting into too many specifics, they kind of take that a step further. They do a good job. I feel like he's always been made out to be this character, but they do a good job of essentially making him Courage the Cowardly Dog, where it's like, this guy's just terrified of everything going on around him, but there's some part of him that compulsively has to take part in the courageous act, for lack of a better term. But all the characters were really a lot of fun. Playing as all these characters was so much fun. I know I've gotten into that a little bit with Impa, but the same reigns true for Urbosa. Man, Urbosa was one of my favorite characters to play as. What a moveset. Like, you talk about feeling powerful. Or like, damn, dude. Like, that's one of the things I loved about Urbosa. She's a very tall, very large character. So when you're going toe-to-toe with these large enemies, it feels very natural for her. As opposed to maybe playing as Link and Zelda, who are rather shorter when compared to her. But going back to the story as a whole, there are things the story did that I did like, and there are things the story did that I didn't like. For example, Astor, I thought was kind of a weak villain. I think he started off very strong, but I almost feel like Master Kuga and Suga, I hope I'm saying their names right, were actually better villains. I was actually getting very invested in, like, their friendship. Like, at one point, Master Kuga's like, "You're my best lackey. I can't run." You know, it's like they're silly yet conniving. I almost wanted to see them thwart Astor. I wanted them to be the ones to use Astor and not the other way around, because Astor was a good villain, but I never really felt threatened by him. But knowing what we know about the Yiga clan and Master Kuga, even though they're so silly, like, the Yiga clan felt more intimidating. The Yiga clan felt more like the evil force, because they felt like they belonged there, whereas Astor was more of this anomaly for the Warriors game. So if I'm being honest, I one of my complaints with the story would be I wish the villains were a little stronger, because Master Kuga and the Yiga clan end up uniting with you at the end, which is fun and leads to some cool moments, but I would have preferred if the Yiga clan kind of just stayed as the villains the entire time. I see we're coming up. We're over 20 minutes here, so I'm going to start speeding us up a little bit. But I will say, I had a moment. I had a very surreal moment towards the end of the game. I had a very, very surreal moment. That, in many ways, I almost felt like the eyes of my younger self were looking at the game. Because I don't know about you guys, when I was younger and I was playing a lot of these older Zelda games and stuff, I used to imagine the stories in my head, right? Like long car rides with your parents, you just sit there and you'd imagine like your own Zelda story happening, and you would do the things that, say, Ocarina of Time didn't, or Majora's Mask didn't. So anyway, I had this moment during one of the final missions where there's this giant battle taking place in Hyrule. And I remember just running around, and it's like you look to your left and you see the Gorons fighting this big stone talus. You look to the right and you see the Rito going toe-to-toe with some Lizalfos. You know, you look north, you see the Gerudo go doing battle with a Hinox. You know, it's like everywhere you looked, there was just this final battle where, like, no matter where you went, you saw the species and the champions of Hyrule doing battle unified. It was just like, it was a war scene that only used to exist in your imagination. You know what I'm saying? And to see it fleshed out, and to play as Link and Zelda running through the chaos in the middle of this giant war, it was just this very surreal moment that only ever really existed in my head before this. And, you know, there's something I noticed that's just as true for this version of Hyrule Warriors as it was for the last, and that it's very obvious, and I want to make sure I'm getting the company name right. Let me see it. Is it Koei Tecmo? I always say these things wrong. Let's just go with Koei Tecmo. I'm pretty sure. I'm like 90% sure that's what it is. But it's very obvious that Koei Tecmo has people who love the Legend of Zelda series working on this game. You could just feel that the people who worked on this game were fans of Breath of the Wild. It was just obvious. It was just all there. They delivered the character moments that we missed out on. They delivered, as I said, that epic, like, war scene. Like, come on. Like, let's just be real for a second. For the love of God. Like, the Gorons, the Rito, the Zora, the Gerudo, all coming together. Like, it's just so hype. And it was just so... Again, I brought up earlier, when the gameplay and storytelling work together. That's just a very good example of it. I want to say, you know, even though I wasn't a big fan of a lot of the new characters that were introduced, I loved Tarako. Now, again, Tarako's the little egg-shaped guardian who has an affinity for Zelda. I loved him. I love characters like that, because I feel like in so many ways, Like, he's an example of what could be unique to the Zelda series. Having protagonists who don't say a word, but you end up getting attached to them anyway. And that's one thing, before I continue on Tarako, I want to say, like, they did a fantastic job building Link's character in this game. And as we say, it's always difficult to build up a character who doesn't speak, but between just his facial expressions, the cutscene reactions, his interactions with other characters, like, they really did a good job at building up Link, and you could see that Rivali's insults towards him, calling him the fallen knight and all of that, it hits him. It hits him in his ego. It hits him a little bit. And there's, little moments like that that really mean a lot to me. Because Link, for obvious reasons, character-wise, doesn't really get a lot of development in these games. But in Hyrule Warriors, they really did a good job to make you feel for him. Like, I felt really attached to this version of Link, as I also felt really attached to this version of Zelda, which brings us into Tarako. That ending scene, man, where you have to fight him, where he gets corrupted and you have to fight him, like, oh, you feel those blows. I remember I was playing it and just going, don't make me do this, don't make me do this, as I'm like just slicing him to hell. And then like he sings Zelda's lullaby as he's like half broken, just really, really delivered on that front. I think the character they made in Tarako, a character who doesn't speak, like he almost feels like a baby Yoda type character, right? It almost kind of feels that way. This adorable character where you can only really make out the concept of what they're trying to communicate. They can't actually communicate with you word to word. I love what they did with his character, thrusting him at the center of it, involving him in the climax. Everything about that I absolutely love. Now, I was getting into this a little bit earlier. I want to get into it now. One thing I've always wanted was to play as Zelda and fight Ganon. That is something I've wanted for years. Because Zelda's there for a lot of our battles with Ganon. She was there in the Ocarina of Time battle. She was there in the Twilight Princess battle. She's in theory there. She's there for the Breath of the Wild battle. She's there. She's usually always with us. She's usually with us during those battles. But we never get to play as her. Not anymore. I mean, they give you the option who to fight Ganon with, but once I saw the option was Zelda, I took it, man. This is another example of taking something that only existed in my imagination before and making it a real thing. I got to play as Zelda and fight the big bad. And as a fan of the Zelda series, that did mean a lot to me. And in many ways, while I was disappointed that this wasn't a true prequel, I am excited that maybe this is something they can just keep doing. Maybe the Warriors franchise can just continue this timeline, right? We created a timeline split. Maybe over here is just where all the Warriors games are going to happen. Because I'm not going to lie to you guys, I want more Hyrule Warriors games. I loved the first one. I love this one. I've already put 50 hours into it. I want more. Seriously. And look, at the end of the day, there's nothing that happens in this game that affects Breath of the Wild 1. Hold on one second. Excuse me. Had a nice coffee before this. But anyway, there's nothing that happens in this game that invalidates or changes what happens in Breath of the Wild 1. What will be interesting to see are there any implications from this game that will have an effect in Breath of the Wild 2? We'll see. I don't know. I'm happy either way. Look, overall, it was a really fun game. It's a really good game. The character moments made me laugh. At some points, I teared up. Brought me joy seeing the chemistry flow between them. Like, I could keep going. Like, I do want to make this a relatively shorter podcast episode because I'm by myself. I don't like to make those last too long. But so many of the character moments, like between Urbosa and Zelda, between the king and Zelda, like those relationships were built up so much more, Daruk and Rivali had me cracking up too. You know, they're cracking jokes at each other. One's Daruk, he's just a clown. Then you have Rivali, who takes everything just way too seriously. And then having those two opposites collide made for a lot of fun moments. I will say, and for those of you who might have listened to my earlier podcast episode on this, there was something else I wanted from this that I didn't get. But I got something that I think might even be better. I have always been a proponent about getting to see Zelda's mother. Zelda's mother is almost always talked about, but we never see her. Never. Breath of the Wild, they talk about her mother a lot. Age of Calamity, they talk about her mother a lot. And I wanted to see it. That's what I was fishing for. I'm like, I want to see that. And at the end of the game, they teased it. For a split second, they teased it. And I have to think that they know what they're doing. And they're either going to reveal Zelda's mother in Breath of the Wild 2 or in some Age of Calamity DLC. And to close this out, I suppose, would I be interested in Age of Calamity DLC? You're goddamn right I would. You're goddamn right I would. I would love it if they expanded this game. Because it is so much fun. And by the way, like, the co-op mode is so much fun. I wish that the camera angle could be a little bit better because you lose, like, the top half of your plane of vision. And I wish there was a way that maybe the default camera could have us a little bit lower so you could see a better perspective. But the co-op is a blast to play as. It's good to have couch co-op back. I'd be interested in DLC. I think it would be fun. But overall, let me just wrap this up here. And let me just tell you, if you're a fan of the Zelda series, if you're a fan of Breath of the Wild, this game is going to make you happy. Like, it is, I think IGN said this or something, so it's not an original thought, but this is a love letter to Breath of the Wild. And getting to play as all these other characters that you know you're not going to get to play as in a mainline game is special. There's something special about that. And say what you will, I'm over here and I want all my favorite franchises to get Warrior spin-offs. You know what I'm saying? Give me a Star Fox Warriors. Give me a Kingdom Hearts Warriors. Come on, let's go. At the end of the day, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity does stand to be its own thing. It's not a true prequel to Breath of the Wild. It stands to be its own thing. And on its own, they tell a good story with some things I don't like. I wanted Master Kuga and Suga to be the main villains. If I could just be transparent about that. That's my biggest complaint. My second biggest complaint about the story is I wish it was a true prequel. But disregarding these two things, they really did tell a good story. The character moments were heartwarming, funny, tear-jerking at times. The gameplay is fun. The interface is smooth. The music is immersive. I think they did a really good job. This podcast is not a review of Age of Calamity, but if I had to give it a score, I'd say right now, I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10, 8 out of 10 on a good day. It's a solid game. I absolutely loved it. If you're watching this, you've probably played it, but if you decided to watch this and you haven't played it, play it. It's a good time. Trust me. Would I lie to you? But anyway, that's going to be our episode, everybody. I want to thank you all again so much for tuning in. The fact that any of you want to hear my crazy ramblings is delightful to me. I know I say that all the time, but really, really appreciative of everybody who listens to this podcast on the audio platforms, or maybe you're one of the people who watch it on YouTube. Really thankful for all of you. Big shout out to the Sages of the Lodge. Big shout out to Nintendo and Koei Tecmo for absolutely crushing it on this one. I look forward to seeing what else will come from this, and let's pray for that Breath of the Wild 2 trailer at the Game Awards. What do you say? Wouldn't that be something? But anyway, that's all I've got for all of you. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.